Joe Biden recently announced a new COVID-19 stimulus plan that includes, among other things, raising the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour. Separately, congressional Democrats have reintroduced the Raise the Wage Act, which would gradually raise the minimum wage to $15 per hour by 2025. The federal minimum wage was last raised to $7.25 per hour back in 2009. In fact, we're currently in the longest stretch of time the minimum wage has gone unchanged since it was introduced back in 1938. The original goal of the minimum wage was to ensure every American was able to make a livable wage regardless of what their job was.
People forget that the federal minimum wage was enacted during the hard times of the Great Depression. FDR called it an essential part of economic recovery.
So, what happens if the federal minimum wage is raised to $15 per hour?
At $7.25 an hour, the current federal minimum wage is worth just $15,000 a year. That's actually worth less than the minimum wage in 1950 in terms of spending power.
How you'll be affected depends a lot on where you live and what you do for a living. As of the beginning of 2021, 30 states and the District of Columbia have committed to minimum wages higher than $7.25 per hour. That means millions of Americans are still being paid the federal minimum wage. That includes New Hampshire, the home state of W.S. Badger, a natural skincare company.
Well, Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont all have a much higher minimum wage. New Hampshire still has $7.25. Badger actually pays $15 an hour as the base starting wage, and we base that on the living wage here in our region. And we felt that as a company here, that it was our responsibility to our employees and also to the community to start our wage structure at something that was livable.
According to the Economic Policy Institute, workers of color are more likely to be paid poverty-level wages, meaning they would most benefit from the increase. And according to the AFL-CIO, if the federal minimum wage had kept up with worker productivity, it would currently be approximately $24 per hour.
We feel it's unethical business models that get set up that take advantage of that low wages, where they're basically dependent on government welfare to fill in with food stamps and housing assistance, and the taxpayer ends up paying for it one way or another.
But can businesses really afford to have the minimum wage raised, especially in these tough economic times? One common criticism of raising the minimum wage is that it will lead to an increase in the cost of consumer goods.
Small business groups like the SBE Council and International Franchise Association warning that the move could slow an already challenging recovery.
I'm not sure that it's fair to burden everything on the small business owner and then have us make the decision as to how much of this do we want to, or are we going to have to pass on to our customers.
The starting base salary of $15 an hour didn't make as much of a difference as we thought it might when we first looked at raising that base salary. And right now, our business is successful in part because of the products that we create and also in part because of the business we run, and that our customers are looking for businesses that are doing the right thing.
It's important to keep in mind how businesses are impacted by a minimum wage that hasn't kept up with the cost of living. So 70% of the US economy is driven by consumer spending. It's bad for business when working people can't afford the basics, much less replacing bald tires, buying a pair of shoes for their kids, or buying school supplies.
Another concern is that it will lead to an increase in automation as companies try to avoid paying the higher wages, which will lead to a loss of jobs.
Just take a look at, your average McDonald's in this country now. 5 years ago, you walked up, there were 3 or 4 counter people waiting there to take your order. You walk in now, there's 1 counter person and 4 computer kiosks.
So could higher wages lead to a decrease in jobs? In 2014, Seattle voted to gradually increase the city's minimum wage. A study by the University of Washington in 2017 determined that rising wages in Seattle led to decreased work hours, partially negating the benefits. However, in New York City, employment rates from 2009 to 2018 grew faster than the national average, even as the city's minimum wage increased to one of the highest levels in the country. In short, there's no consistent evidence that a higher minimum wage directly affects employment levels one way or the other.
Automation has been happening since the Industrial Revolution. It is happening in states where we've kept the minimum wage low, as well as happening in states that have raised their minimum wage.
We've increased the minimum wage 30 some times, and every time we do it, somebody says it's going to create unemployment. It really doesn't. Workers get more money in their pockets. They spend the money, they create demand, and that demand will create jobs.
Before COVID, we had incredibly low unemployment with highly automated industries. New kinds of jobs emerge. Some jobs are, become obsolete, but then others open.
So, if many states have already raised the minimum wage, why should the federal government be involved at all? Couldn't it just be left up to the states? According to a study by MIT, even in states with low costs of living, $7.25 an hour is no longer considered a livable wage for a family of 4.
Being from a state, New Hampshire, where we follow the federal wage and we're waiting for the federal minimum wage to raise before we have it raised here, means that we're at a disadvantage.
It's a smart policy that levels the playing field for business so that those who are voluntarily paying a wage that their workers can live on are not subsidizing their competitors through the taxpayer-funded social safety net.
If and when the federal minimum wage does go up, how it affects you depends a lot on where you live and what industry you're in. If you're already in an area with a higher minimum wage, you might not notice it as much. And if you are in a state that is still using the $7.25 hourly minimum wage, while the changes likely won't be immediate, over time they could be huge.